This is chapter 14, part 4. We are talking about some of the concerns about this bivariate correlation between gun restrictiveness and gun homicides across the United States. And that's a state level analysis, but really, one could argue that if we're going to conduct homicide, macro level homicide studies, that it makes sense to study cities, to compare cities across the country, because that's where most of the action is. That's where most homicide happens. Rural, small town areas tend to have much lower homicide rates. And so, because of that, it's sort of more comparable to compare large cities across the country as opposed to comparing states. Because again, that's where really a lot of the action is, and these sort of comparable geographical units. Now, on the other side of that, I will say that laws, if you're looking at laws, those are state determined, right? These are not determined. Most laws are not determined by cities. Their laws are determined at the state level. But you do have city local policies, city ordinances that deal with gun restrictiveness as well. And you can have a state that can have very restrictive, may have a more restrictive policies with respect to guns in cities than you do out in the countryside and rural areas. So that, again, that's another caution I would make, that city level analysis is probably better, would be more suited here than comparing states. Coincidentally, the high concentration of guns, if we're talking about really where do you find a lot of guns, you find a lot of guns in the countryside. 65, 70% of farmers have guns. And so that's an argument on the sort of the pro-gun end of the argument, is that you would expect, if guns were really driving homicides in general or mass shootings in general, that you should really, it's the countryside, it's the farmers who should be killing a lot of people, because there you have much, much higher levels of gun ownership, general gun ownership, than you do in cities. In big cities, take your pick, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, you have much lower levels of gun ownership, maybe 5-10% compared to 70% in the countryside. So you would expect, if guns were really driving homicide, you'd expect it to be happening in the countryside. But indeed, where is it happening? It's happening in the big cities. So the author rightly points out that it's quite easy for a person who is ineligible to legally buy a gun can get someone else to buy it for him or her, and I don't think the author gives the term for that, straw purchase, at least in this context. So that's what they call it, when you get somebody who's, let's say you're underage, and so you get somebody, an older friend, to go buy guns for you, as was done in the case of the Columbine shootings. That's called a straw purchase, and it's pretty easy to do. So that's one easy way, easy loophole for ineligible people to get their hands on guns, is just to find a friend who's eligible to go buy it for you. And so that's a problem. That loophole is a problem when it comes to keeping guns out of the hands of people who should not have possession of these guns. The author covers many issues concerning gun laws, but overall, the research provides little evidence that most laws aimed at reducing general gun ownership reduce violence. So it's just not, the evidence is not very compelling that these gun laws are working at reducing total homicide, and would be even less confident in our conclusions about mass shootings, which have not been studied for very long, unfortunately, and we need a lot more data on it, and they are difficult to study because of because they're rare, and rare things are hard to study. So by contrast, laws that target criminal ownership, that focus on more narrowly, more specifically on the problem, the problematic ownership of guns. In other words, guns by criminals or violent prone people. The laws that target the criminal population seem to be more effective at lowering violence, like stop and frisk, which is kind of a controversial thing, but stop and frisk has been shown to reduce violence in certain urban areas where this stop and frisk has at times been a relied upon strategy to fight violence has been stop and frisk, and there's some evidence that that sort of approach, again, where you're targeting the criminal population as opposed to targeting the general population, the vast majority of which are law-abiding people. So you can argue anyway that it makes sense to have these targeted policies where we're trying to get to at-risk populations, criminal populations. Those should, you would think that those would be more effective at lowering violence because it's targeted as opposed to blanket. If you have a blanket approach that restricts gun ownership in general, that's kind of a needle in a haystack approach. You're hoping that by attacking the haystack, targeting the haystack, that you're going to get a few needles in there. But again, I think I put in maybe this next point, but I put in here somewhere, I think, that according to the research, 98% of guns never get misused. It's the 2% of guns, the small minority, the exceptional gun that gets misused, that gets abused by a criminal. And so if your approach is to attack that 100% of guns, to try to restrict the 100%, well, that's a very untargeted, it's a very it's kind of using a sledgehammer as opposed to a surgical knife to address the problem, right? A scalpel is getting closer to the problem than the sledgehammer type of approach. Mass confiscations, which reduce, so let's imagine a hypothetical situation where you had massive confiscations like have been done in England, in New Zealand and Australia, where if just imagine a hypothetical situation, the United States has very roughly 400 million guns. If you could have a confiscation policy where you could reduce that 400 million, let's say you could reduce that 400 million down to levels of gun ownership that were like Japan or something, where hardly anybody has a gun, where there's just a few million as opposed to 400 million. That definitely seems plausible that you could put a serious dent in not only general homicide, but perhaps mass shootings as well, if you were to reduce that gun availability from 400 million guns down to just something much smaller than that. Although I will say that the evidence in England and Australia is not super compelling. I think it's more compelling for the mass shootings. It seems that mass shootings have gone down in those countries since they confiscated. They made rules that banning huge swaths of gun ownership. That seems to have reduced the mass shooting issue. It's less compelling looking at total homicide. It's not so clear that it's reduced total homicide, which again is really the big picture issue as opposed to the small picture issue of just the mass shootings. So some people might be impressed with the experience of England and Australia. Other people not so much, depending what you're kind of focusing on. But the problem in the United States with doing something like that is it's just not politically feasible. You're not going to be able realistically, at least under current conditions, to change America where it's going to go from 400 million guns down to a tiny little fraction of that. It's just not politically feasible. So a lot of these gun law reform proposals are sort of futzing around at the edges. It's kind of it's almost Band-Aid type stuff. It's small. When you have a gun stock of 400 million guns out there, these little narrowly tailored new laws are really just kind of playing around at the edges, and you would not, just from a common sense point of view, wouldn't necessarily expect them to be very effective up against 400 million guns in the hands of Americans, right? So again, that's there's the political feasibility issue there. The author makes a good point that gun possession by the mentally ill is quite common, and that proper policies need to be debated. I think that's right. That's one area that we probably need to talk about more as a country, is we have laws against gun possession among criminals, the criminally convicted population. But what about not everybody who's going to abuse a gun has been convicted of a crime? What about people who have not been convicted of a crime but have mental conditions that could make them dangerous, could make them threatening? That we at least need to have a good debate about: do we need to have policies about gun ownership, gun possession among at-risk populations? For example, those with mental diagnoses that make one more prone to improper gun use. Uh, uh, that's something that needs to be debated and studied empirically much more than it has been. Some advocate for the increased presence of police at public events and also in schools. Some also recommend more target hardening. What we mean by target hardening, if you're not familiar with this term, is increasing the security of various locations, increasing the security of a school, increasing the security of public spaces, maybe with things like metal detectors, with locked doors at school. The increased security that you see now in schools compared to like when I was a kid and we didn't really have any security at all for these kind of things. The design of schools where you could have a single entrance slash exit in the school that you monitor and have high security, perhaps a security guard, perhaps an officer with an office at this single entrance exit of a school. So you could, there's issues of how you design your facilities in various ways. Again, all of that underneath the umbrella of what we call target hardening, metal detectors, etc. Now, the effectiveness of these, I would say the effectiveness of these different policies is unclear. Again, we don't have a lot of studies. You need to build up a body of good studies to be able to draw any strong conclusions, confident conclusions about whether these things work or not. You have a lot of opinions on a lot of this gun stuff and other kinds of approaches, You have a lot of really strong opinions, a lot of passion there, based on not a lot of data and not a lot of good quality, impressive studies. So we've got a lot to learn about what works and what doesn't work. Now, you also have the argument that if we had more citizens who were encouraged to have guns, to carry guns, to keep them on their person, to keep them close when they're in public spaces, when they're in schools, if they were trained and if they possessed those guns and were well trained in their use, that this could serve as we're getting back to the deterrence hypothesis. This could scare off the bad guys or stop the bad guys if you had more in the public who were encouraged to, or that were allowed and encouraged and trained to carry guns to be able to fight back and potentially deter would-be killers. Um, According to the criminologist John Lott's research, almost all mass shootings happen in gun-free zones, so places where guns are not supposed to be, and law-abiding citizens don't carry guns in those areas where you have these restrictions and they're supposed to be gun-free. That's according to Lott's evidence, almost all the time, that's where these mass shootings happen, is where people are not supposed to have guns. So all your law-abiding citizens are unarmed. They're sitting ducks, according to Lott, vulnerable targets, which, according to Lott, are targeted, are selected by these killers because killers want to find vulnerable targets who won't fight back. They want fish in a barrel. They're wanting to maximize kills without anybody fighting back. And so they look, according to Lott, the hypothesis there, the claim, is that by discouraging or prohibiting gun carrying by law-abiding citizens, it actually invites these killers to target these gun-free zones, and where citizens are unarmed and basically sitting ducks. Again, the problem is that we don't have agreement, or we don't have date. The scholars disagree about the effectiveness of all of these things. Scholars disagree about whether more carrying reduces violent crime in general or mass shootings specifically. So you've got data, you've got studies that go both ways on this. And so it's sort of unclear whether more carrying it reduces the violence issue or not, or makes things worse. The author, for example, argues that this, a lot more caring by individuals could just make things worse because, you could accidentally a law-abiding citizen could accidentally shoot a bystander in trying to fight back against a killer and make things worse, or when the police show up, they don't know who the killer is and who law-abiding citizens just trying to fight back who are, and so the wrong people could get killed. Police might kill a person who's just trying to help. So, so there's these sorts of issues that are important to consider. Um, and a major problem with self-defensive use of guns is that the perpetrator always has the upper hand. You have the element of surprise. If you're these killers, they plan these events very carefully. They show up. They've been thinking about it for a long time. They're ready. And an innocent bystander who's armed is taken by surprise. There's an element of surprise. And so these mass killers have the drop on you. It's hard to fight back when they have that element of surprise. And so most of the time you see that people don't return fire, that most of the time that people do not offer effective resistance. There certainly are cases. It's not hard to find cases of people who shoot back and kill the mass killer. That certainly happens, but it doesn't happen like the majority of the time or a lot. It's more the exception than the rule that people are able to successfully fight back. It certainly happens, but it's not common. So, and a lot of this is element of surprise, and also you would say that most of the time you do have a small percent of the population that carries, but it's not a large percent of the population. I think it's something like about 5% or something of citizens who will carry in public. So it's a small majority. It's not a for all that's talked about, it's not that common of a practice. Even with all the citizens who carry, effective incidents of stopping mass shooting are not common. So I've made that point. Keep in mind that the police arm and train themselves against surprise attacks. So this is something that law enforcement, the police, have to deal with every day, and and they show that with proper training and in the sort of proper individuals who are selected into law enforcement with proper training and experience, that in violent exchanges between police and suspects, the police 9 times, if you have a fatal shooting between police and resisting suspects, 9 times out of 10, the police win. The suspect is killed. Only 1 out of 10 times is the police officer killed. So in those situations, you do see that officers have prepared themselves to be able to defend themselves and others successfully against suspects, uh, effectively defend themselves 9 times out of 10 where there's a legal somebody when somebody dies. 9 times out of 10 it's going to be the suspect and not the police officer. So even though there's the suspects may sometimes have this element of surprise on their side, not certainly not all the time by far, but sometimes the suspects will have element of surprise. Still, these officers are able to fight back quite effectively. Criminologist Gary Kleck argues that gun control efforts should be focused on common crime where it can do the most good. So he argues that research indicates that targeting criminal possession works, but generally speaking, restrictions against law-abiding gun owners are ineffective. So that's a point that's made earlier. Again, that's sort of his reading of the data. Other people would disagree with him on that. So there's lots of disagreement, unfortunately, in this area. A lot of heat and passion and argument, much more so than there is good, strong data. Um, Now, Kleck would say, just to make a couple points, he would say that you're going to have least effective gun control against these mass shooters because they're such planners and they're so deliberate in their planning and take weeks and months to prepare, and they're very resourceful, that it's going to be hard to block them getting a gun one way or another. These are not impulsive killers who, if there's a gun, on the side table, they're going to kill somebody. And if they don't have a gun, they are right at their easy disposal that they won't commit the homicide. They're not like that type of killer, not impulsive. They're planners. They're hunting around. They're doing what it takes to get ready for that kill. And so he would say these are the type of killers who are going to be the hardest to get to stop through gun control. He would say it's much more effective to try to target general criminal gun violence as opposed to these mass killers. Again, it could be a difference in priorities. The priorities you have for the mass killers may lead to more problems or less effective policies towards the general problem of gun violence and homicide in general. So I won't, again, I could take that further, but we're short on time. 98% of all guns are never misused, so according to Collect, general gun restrictions waste much of the public's goodwill. That we should focus our gun control efforts on where the most effective, um, uh, effectiveness is, I think, is definitely something we should be very worried about, very concerned about. One avenue is to exploit the public nature of social media. Many killers express their violent threats and intentions online. So as we kind of wind up this chapter, I think one soft spot, one area that we could exploit in terms of policy or strategy of how to fight these mass shooters, which I would admit I think is a very difficult problem to fight, is that since these guys do leak a lot, they do verbalize their threats a lot, and they verbalize them a lot on social media. Social media is a public space, and constitutionally, you don't really, the Supreme Court does not considers public spaces to be a place where you shouldn't expect privacy. You shouldn't expect people to not be listening in. And so you could at least argue that you constitutionally you could be monitoring social media for these sorts of threats. If somebody says I'm going to shoot up my school, that person be contacted, they'd be investigated, perhaps arrested if there's probable cause, and following due process and following not parting from the Constitution, but following the Constitution, that you through due process you could remove this person's, if this person possesses any guns or any guns in the household, that those could be removed. Um, and family members and friends could be all notified that this person has threatened on social media that they're going to shoot up the school or something. So you could then take action. The point is, if you monitored and really had active response to these threats, which these people commonly make in social media, that's sort of a place where you could target at-risk people, and again target as opposed to a general blanket kind of approach, and might be able to potentially stop some of these killings in this manner. So if policies were implemented at targeting these individuals and confiscating their guns and alerting their acquaintances and friends about their online threats, all while following constitutional principles of due process, some shootings might be prevented. So that, I think, that's an avenue and probably politically speaking, that you would have bipartisan support for this sort of monitoring, targeting people who are making clear threats of violence in on these public spaces nowadays, where people are using so much, which is social media. That's the public square nowadays. Okay, that's just to wrap up the chapter with an idea. Again, we need more ideas, and we need research, good, solid, sophisticated research to find out what's going to work most effectively.